My presentation will investigate how games can serve as musical notation, and by that imbue sound with a wider meaning. It will develop the term Ludified notation and show how it comes into play, literally speaking, in ScoreCraft, a multiplayer music game I'm developing as part of my research on the transferability of game design into experimental music composition. By Ludified notation, I mean a musical notation in which a game is used to direct musical action. Using games within a musical context is by no means a new thing. For example, Ghiselin Dankert's 1535 Ave Maristella uses chess to structure the realization of a four-part motet. Moreover, in recent years, there's been a growing interest in drawing from digital games as a means to expand the possibilities of musical artistic expression. For example, Paul Turowski's PhD dissertation, Digital Game as Musical Notation, and the monograph Ludified, edited by Marco Titiliani, Barbara Lüneburg, and Andreas Pirchner. Therefore, there is a rich body of works to which the term Ludified notation can be applied. In developing this term, I'm building on a rather open conception of musical notation, poetically captured by Cornelius Cardew in his treatise handbook, Notation is a way of making people move. Similarly, a game is also a way of making people move. This is evident in the following citation from Brenda Laurel, quoted by Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman in their extensive theoretical framework for game design. The designers of Space War, the first computer game, identified action as the key ingredient and conceived Space War as a game that could provide a good balance between thinking and doing for its players. They regarded the computer as a machine naturally suited for representing things that you could see, control, and play with. Its interesting potential lay not in its ability to perform calculations, but in its capacity to represent action in which humans could participate. Accordingly, Ludified notation is about harnessing games' capacity to represent action for musical purposes. To give you a first-hand experience of Ludified notation, I'd like to play a ScoreCraft game with you, a mini-game called Darts. I should say that usually ScoreCraft games are played online in multiplayer mode. Each player controls the game by producing sound captured by their own microphone, which requires a physical separation between the players, as otherwise sound produced by one player might interfere with the input of another. But because here we are all very close to one another, I mean, physically speaking, we'll play the game collectively as a single player. You can see this Zoom H5 microphone will capture the sound in the room in order to control the game, which in the case of darts will respond to our collective loudness. I already have the game set up in another tab. So let me just click Start, and I'll open the Zoom, again on the Zoom. The game itself is pretty simple. You can see the instructions on the left. The goal is to hit blue targets. Vertical position corresponds to mean loudness over the specified duration. You can see the duration in the bottom right corner. In this case, it's 3 seconds, but it will change over the course of the game. And the little squares represent instantaneous loudness measurements. Okay, so how can we hit the first target? Because the target is high, we'll need to produce quite loud sounds. So I invite you to make some noise and try to hit these targets. it can get pretty difficult, as you can see. Let's go back to the presentation. Okay, so drawing on this citation from Laurel, Selen and Zimmerman introduced the concept of a choice molecule, which is an action linked to an outcome. Multiple choice molecules can be stringed together to build larger interactive structures where the outcome of one action serves as the context for the next action. Building on this idea, Selen and Zimmerman develop a framework to dissect a choice molecule, a set of 5 questions outlining the anatomy of a choice in a game. 1, what happened before the player was given the choice? 2, how is the possibility of choice conveyed to the player? 3, how did the player make the choice? 4, what is the result of the choice? How will it affect future choices? And 5, how is the result of the choice conveyed to the player? Selen and Zimmerman describe each of these 5 questions as an event, distinguishing between internal events, which correspond to questions 1, 3, and 4, and are related to the way the choice is processed by the game system, and external events, which correspond to questions 2 and 5, and are related to the way the choice is represented to the player. Applying this to Ludified notation, the musicness of a musical action can be manifested as either an internal event, in which case the player makes a choice by playing music, or an external event, in which case the music represents the result of a choice made by the player. Darts is an example of the former, of musical actions manifested as internal events of making choices by playing music, by producing sound, which Turovsky calls control sound, defined as mapping sonic features to control functions. Another way to categorize Selen and Zimmerman's 5 questions is to distinguish between events concerning the game logic, corresponding to questions 1 and 4, and events concerning the interface, corresponding to questions 2, 3, and 5, where the questions 2 and 5 address the output of the interface, and question 3 addresses the input of the interface. Michael Liebe, writing on the role of the interface in music games, differentiates between symbolic and objective interfaces. A symbolic interface mainly establishes a representational or figurative relationship between the players and the game engine, or in-game actions. As an example, Liebe gives Vib Ribbon, a rhythm game in which the player guides a rabbit through a level consisting of 4 types of obstacles and their 6 combinations, each requiring a different maneuver activated by a different button or combination of buttons on the PlayStation controller. Although there's some visual similarity between the obstacles and the PlayStation controller buttons, Liebe describes the interface of Vib Ribbon as symbolic because there's no intuitive connection between the maneuvers and the action of pressing the buttons. Conversely, in an objective interface, the movements of the players mimic what is actually happening in the game. Liebe gives Guitar Hero as an example. As in Guitar Hero, the presentation of the actions on the screen is the same as what the players do with the plastic guitar-like controller. Liebe notes that games using Kinects to track the player's body movement take this principle a step further, allowing for an even greater similarity between player movement and in-game actions. While it's reasonable to describe certain action-to-image relationships as objective, applying this to control sound, it seems quite a stretch to call a sound-to-image relationship objective. That said, it's possible to draw on common cross-modal correspondences to create intuitive relationships between sound and image. For example, in darts, loudness is mapped to vertical position, an intuitive correspondence, as evident, for example, by expressions like "don't raise your voice." Similarly, time in darts is mapped to horizontal position, reflecting a common perception of the progression of time. Regarding the output of the interface, it's important to note that in darts, the game doesn't tell the player directly whether they should play louder or quieter or maintain their current loudness. Instead, the player has to compare their position to the target's position and size and assess how close they are to the target in order to determine how they need to adjust their loudness. The smaller the target, the more challenging this is, especially at the beginning of a throw when the player is on the left side of the screen far away from the target, as you could experience, I think. Moreover, darts takes loudness measurements numerous times a second, which makes it challenging for the player to assess rationally in real time how they need to adjust their loudness. Salen and Zimmerman acknowledge that choice does not necessarily imply obvious or rational choice. Choice can take many forms, from an intuitive physical action to the random throw of a die. Accordingly, choice in darts takes the form of an intuitive physical action, adjusting loudness. Musical notation is rarely just about giving directions. In his book chapter, Writing Music, Michael Pizarro states that experimental music confronts ideas about writing. He explains, "This music raises again and again fundamental questions about the conditions, that is, the mechanics, the system of reference, the function and the process of writing, as an exploration of what the hand can do, as a way of giving performers directions, as a frame of reference for sounds, as a model for certain kinds of musical behavior." Pizarro points here to experimental music notation's tendency to also suggest something other than their mere function of directing musical action. Often, this results in a wider meaning given to sound by notation. For example, graphic notation imbues sound with meaning created by an image, and verbal notation imbues sound with meaning created by text. Similarly, Ludified notation imbues sound with meaning created by game. According to Salen and Zimmerman, gameplay takes place within a representational universe, filled with depictions of objects, interactions, and ideas out of which a player makes meaning. And while games often represent using images and texts, representation in games is primarily procedural. All games can in fact be considered simulations, state Salen and Zimmerman, defining simulation as a procedural representation of aspects of reality. By procedural representation, they mean a process-based dynamic form of depiction, emerging from the combination of the formal system of a game and the interaction of a player with the game. By aspects of reality, they mean that a simulation cannot depict every aspect of something. It has to choose a very small subset of characteristics around which to build its representation. In other words, simulations are abstractions. A simulation abstracts certain features of its subject while ignoring others. Choosing which features to abstract and which to ignore in a game simulation isn't necessarily driven by accuracy and realism, as is usually the case with scientific simulations, but rather by what serves best the game in question. Darts create a procedural representation of dart throwing, which is itself a procedural representation of hunting. Darts abstracts the core elements of dart throwing, an arrow and a target, as well as the mechanic of throwing an arrow at a target and the goal of hitting a target. That said, following the notion that a game simulation doesn't have to be realistic, dart is not intended to be an accurate representation of dart throwing. Most notably, in darts, physics works differently. Whereas in real-world dart throwing, the player can only influence the movement of the arrow before they release it. In darts, the player controls the arrow during its movement towards the target. For example, for this reason, the throw duration in darts can be unrealistically slow, here 10 seconds. Darts links a procedural representation of dart throwing with a representation of sound that abstracts loudness and time while ignoring other musical parameters. As the vertical dimension represents loudness, silence is analogous to gravity, pulling the player down by lowering the mean loudness. Accordingly, darts imbues sound with a very specific meaning, throwing an arrow at a target. For the player, this involves responding to the game outcome as it's materializing in real time, for example, with excitement when overcoming a bad start, or with frustration when only realizing towards the end of a throw that it's actually going to miss the target. Closely related to this discussion of meaning is James Saunders' notion that game-like simulations can provide composers with a way to inflect action-based pieces with a purpose which goes beyond simply carrying out the instructions. Saunders builds on Ian Bogost's concept of procedural rhetoric, the practice of using processors persuasively, and Mary Flanagan and Helen Nissenbaum's approach to game design as a means to communicate values, which they define as properties of things and states of affairs that we care about and strive to attain. For Saunders, these ideas are beneficial because they have the potential to frame music composition as a socially engaged practice. Whereas meaning concerns what a score is about, purpose concerns why it's to be played, that is, what extrinsic aim it might suggest. With regard to darts, although it doesn't present an explicit purpose or address wider social issues, it does communicate values, in particular accuracy, physicality, and competition. To conclude, Ludified notation is a powerful way to direct musical action in a playful manner. Musical action can be manifested as the input or output of the game interface, forming symbolic or objective relationships by drawing on visual similarity, mimicry of movement, and common cross-modal correspondences. Furthermore, Ludified notation can imbue sound with a wider meaning, as well as communicate values, and possibly also present an explicit purpose. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Again, time is short, but maybe one question or one remark may be allowed, if there's an urgent one.
Thank you very much. Goni, maybe can you give us only a very short insight or a hint how you think of connecting these short games of a few seconds, then maybe in a kind of large-scale formal process?
So it depends. So first, these short games can be very long, depends on their mechanics. Some of the mini games can take several minutes. Another way is another game mode that there is in ScoreCraft that is called scenarios, where there are multiple mini games that are arranged on a 2D board, and then players can move from minigame to minigame. So that's kind of a way to create musical form by having different sections. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you again.